Señoras y señores, tengan ustedes muy buenas noches. A nombre del Comité de Finanzas, tengo la grata satisfacción de darles la más cordial bienvenida.
It is my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth session of this committee, wherein you will be witnessing an international internet conference transmitted from the United States of America, which we have titled International Finance and Economic Development for the Americas, with the participation of Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, Jr., international economist, financial expert, and a candidate for the Democratic nomination to the presidency of the United States of America.
We're in a situation in the world now which can best be described as being at the brink of a disintegration of the existing world financial system and monetary arrangements. This is not a matter of predicting the day of a crash. The crisis is systemic, it is not cyclical, and there is no possibility that the world system in its present form could survive the immediate period ahead. This is a result of a change which occurred especially since August of 1971, when the world abandoned a workable system set up by U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, called the old Bretton Woods system. There were many injustices practiced, especially toward developing nations, under that system. But the system itself worked, with some reservations, up until about the middle of the 1960s. In 1971, President Nixon took the first step to end the condition of fixed currency rates or adjustable fixed currency rates by a floating exchange rate system. Since that time, the progress that was made in the United States, Europe, and to some degree elsewhere under the post-war monetary system ended. Since about 1971-72, in point of fact, the world has become generally poorer. We've been living off past capital investment, past real physical capital, draining it down. We've now reached the point, through a series of steps, at which the system is doomed. Now, what we have at the moment is a situation best compared to Germany in 1923, especially during the period from the spring and summer into the autumn of 1923. We're in that kind of situation now. Since especially 1997, with the troubles, so-called troubles in Asia, and then the crisis of mid-1998, the world has entered the terminal phase of this sick system. However, like the German authorities in 1923, the central banking systems and other institutions have been pumping monetary aggregate into the system at fantastic rates and looting everything in sight to maintain this. So therefore, we cannot exactly predict the day this system will collapse. Any accident can cause it to collapse. But generally, we can say this is going like the 1923 hyperinflation in Germany. The madmen will keep pumping the money in to try to keep the system afloat from one day to the next until the system simply disintegrates, or until some event in the meantime intervenes to bring the system down. Therefore, we must expect that we're going to have to face the reality of a general reorganization of the world financial and monetary and trade system in the near future. We will have to scrap globalization. We will have to return to a system of relatively fixed parities among currencies. And we're going to rely largely upon reestablishing the role of the perfectly sovereign nation state and its sovereign currency and monetary system as the partner or the system of partners which will build the new system. What we will have to do is to essentially revive the pre-1971 or pre-1966 type of Bretton Woods system on a global scale. And I would propose there are a number of differences that have to be included in that. First of all, we'll have to repeat the successful experience of the post-war period up till 1971, because that for us is a proven precedent of a workable system. Extending this system to include developing countries in a way we did not in the post-war period is one of the fundamental changes that have to be made. For example, I've emphasized that you cannot build a workable system without including major powers such as China and India as partners in managing the new monetary system. We're going to have to put much of the world through financial bankruptcy reorganization. Much of the world's debt, including the so-called derivatives and related debt, will simply have to be written off. This is now totaled well over $300 trillion of short-term debt in a world whose estimated global gross domestic product is in the order of 11 trillion. Obviously, you cannot carry this debt. Other debt will have to be organized, especially honorable debt, especially the debt of governments. However, we have to recognize, for example, as in the case of the states of the Americas, that under the floating exchange rate system, if you look at the figures, you find out that the nations of the Americas have paid more in debt retirement than they have received in total debt due to them formerly or in the subsequent period. This anomaly has developed precisely because every time there was a run on Ibero-American currencies in international markets, international authorities would come to these countries and tell them to devalue their currency and take other measures, but at the same time not devalue the debts which had been denominated earlier, the foreign debts. And therefore this rewriting of foreign debt and the issuance of new credit against this rewriting caused a debt crisis such that the Ibero-American states have paid more in debt retirement in the past 30 years than the total debt which is actually incurred by them. So much of this debt will have to be reorganized. The ideas of His Holiness Pope John Paul II for a Jubilee year will have to be examined as one of the measures. The other side of this is we're going to have to reorganize our approach to an economy. We're going to have to go through a fixed exchange rate system to an emphasis on long-term credit, not loans, but long-term credit, trade credit, by which, in particular, developing nations which need capital imports will be able to buy these on long-term credit of 1% interest per annum or that order, and with some grants as well, in order to incur capitalization in the order of 5 to 10 to 15, 20, or 30 years, as in the terms of long-term infrastructure. In other words, we must think about building up economies which could not pay such things now, to the point that in the future, through the increase of their productive powers of labor, they are able then to retire some of that capital debt incurred through these long-term extensions of low-cost credit. So therefore, we need that kind of a system. Also, we cannot do this under the present trends of globalization. You must have protectionist policies for all nations. Otherwise, they cannot guarantee the prices for their export commodities which will enable them to meet the old debts or reorganized debts and also carry the new debt incurred through long-term credit at low interest rates. Therefore, we must have a protectionist policy, particularly in respect to building up the infrastructure of countries which are largely importing countries, technology importing countries, to building up their agricultural systems through necessary capital technology imports, to building up their private businesses and their government businesses through these measures, to increase generally the productive powers of labor in these economies. And this means essentially, in my view, that countries such as the United States or the core countries of Western continental Europe, to some degree Russia, which has a large technological potential if it is mobilized, and Japan are going to have to specialize in building up their capacity to export high-grade technology goods and also exporting long-term credit to countries which are presently classed as developing or semi-developing countries. Therefore, we will need a new international division of labor. We're going to have to think in terms of 20 to 30 years of rebuilding and building the world economy. And under those conditions, we can prosper. We must, however, in the meantime, apply some new conceptions as to how to do our financial accounting. Instead of counting things merely in prices, money prices, we're going to have to think in terms of physical content and the functional nature of physical content of these of costs. Now, what I would do on the question of the Americas as such, under that arrangement, is, as I proposed back in 1982 in a book which was called Operation Juarez, which had some popularity in the hemisphere at that time, but not with Henry Kissinger, that what we should sponsor is a special monetary trade arrangement, within the Americas, among the states of the Americas, which the United States could co-sponsor. And on some general idea and agreement on development projects, we would then be able to write off paper on a long term at nominal charges and use otherwise unpayable debt as a negotiable asset, financial asset, which is then used for the purposes of facilitating these kinds of long-term investments and long-term credit structures. Now, for example, let's take the case of Peru concretely. Peru, anyone who's been there, as I have some years ago, knows exactly what infuriates me as an economist about seeing the condition of Peru. And when I look back to these aerial maps of what Peru was a long time ago, before the Spaniards arrived there, a long time before, we realize that this area, which is now considered semi-arid and undeveloped, can be developed. And if we look at the sources of water in the area, if we look at some of the undeveloped areas, the highland areas, we realize that Peru is an excellent investment proposition if it's given the means to build the infrastructure and also get the credit to develop the kinds of industries which fit its opportunities and which enable it to raise its productive powers of labor. Take an example of this. These institutions are generally associated with what's called Project Democracy or the National Endowment for Democracy. They're offshoots. The International Republican Institute and similar things on the Democratic Party side are of that species. Now, I've known this group for a long time, and they're not exactly the people I'd recommend. For example, this is the same group which is pressing for legalization of drugs in the hemisphere, as in Colombia, for example. They would like to do the same in Peru. They would like to bail out Ecuador by using Ecuador in great trouble, bordering the Amazon region, to bring Ecuador into a functioning part of a big surge of cocaine and heroin production in this part of the world. They don't like Peru because they don't like the fact that the Peru defended itself against Sendero Luminoso and its offshoots so successfully some time ago under a president who I think has behaved courageously and correctly in that situation. This idea, anybody who proposes the legalization of drugs, as some people in the United States, including people associated with the Carter Group implicitly, are doing, or the International Republican Institute, in Colombia and elsewhere, are doing the same thing to the Americas, and to the United States too, but to the Americas, that the Palmerston and the British East India Company did to China in the 19th century. Palmerston's demand, which was the issue of the wars against China, was demand that the Chinese legalize drugs. The Chinese did so under gunboat pressures, and they destroyed China internally, and it took a long time before China was restored. The same thing is being done in the case of the Americas. So what they do is they take a government like the government of Peru, which defended itself ably with its military, with limited resources, against a major threat. It may not have eliminated the threat, but it brought it under control. And you compare the condition of Peru today with that in Colombia, where we know that our friends in Colombia had essentially the same ideas as the people in Peru, but in Colombia they weren't able to carry it out. In Peru they did. Some people cannot forgive Peru that. It's that simple. Now, this is an old problem in society. Until certain developments in Europe, that every form of society was based on the overlordship of the people of society by a small group of oligarchs. The oligarchs, with their trusted lackeys, treated the rest of the population as human cattle. Now, the greatest contribution of European civilization to that
I największą jakby wkładem cywilizacji europejskiej w tę część ludzkiej historii
came out of the classical Greek tradition in part. As example is the famous poem of Solon of Athens. The other thing was the development of Christianity.
Potem do tego doszła tradycja chrześcijańska.
And particularly as developed in the epistles of the Apostle Paul.
A zwłaszcza tradycja, która wychodzi z listów świętego Pawła.
Out of which we got a concept which originally was Greek, which was given in European civilization a Christian form, which was called in Greek agape.
Która po grecku nazywa się agape.
That is the law.
I to jest prawo.
That is natural law.
To jest naturalne prawo.
Therefore we say that in a crisis the obligation is the obligation to serve the common good. This is not merely fairness in a dispute.
To nie chodzi tutaj tylko o pewną uczciwość w dyspucie, w sporze.
This is the function of wiser men in society to lead society, to understand that what we must protect is not merely the rights of the living. We must protect the process of development upon which the continuation and betterment of society depend. Look at, for example, two nations on East and South Asia.
Popatrzmy na dwa narody w Azji Południowo-Wschodniej.
China and India.
Chiny i Indie.
China has the world's largest population.
Chiny to jest największa liczba ludności na świecie.
India has a population which will reach over a billion very soon.
Indie mają ludność, która bardzo szybko dojdzie do miliarda.
India has some high technology, but it also has a vast army of greatly poor.
Indie dysponują bardzo nowoczesną technologią w pewnych miejscach, ale z drugiej strony mają ogromną też armię bardzo, bardzo biednych ludzi.
China has developed high technology capabilities, but the future of the Chinese population depends upon the development of the inland areas and the desert areas and the mountainous areas.
Ale przyszłość Chin zależy od możliwości rozwijania interioru, a także, w tym także terenów pustynnych i terenów górskich w głębi kraju.
So these are countries which have some high technology capability, but not enough to meet the needs of their populations as a whole. If we're going to reorganize the world financial and economic system, what we would wish to do is take the areas which formerly have produced high technology, as in the United States, in Western Europe and Japan.
Tak jak w Stanach, w zachodniej Europie czy Japonii.
And increase our production of technology in cooperation with parts of the world that need this technology.
Trzeba zwiększyć wydajność tej nowej technologii we współpracy z tymi obszarami, tymi regionami świata, które takiej technologii potrzebują.
This will require long-term credit system.
To by wymagało kredytów długoterminowych.
Generally reaching to a periods of 25 to 25 years, in other words, a generation.
Generalnie tak długich jak powiedzmy całe pokolenie, 20-25 lat.
This means interest rates, simple interest rates in the order of 1%.
Oznacza to, że oprocentowanie musiałoby być bardzo skromniutkie, rzędu 1%.
And long-term agreements, especially in infrastructure development and in new technologies. Think in the case of Poland, for example.
Popatrzmy na przypadek Polski.
How many revolutions have the Polish people fought to struggle for independence?
Ile tutaj rewolucji było, żeby się wybić na niepodległość?
Why did those fighters who died for that do that?
Dlaczego ci, którzy za to zginęli, to robili?
As instinct like animals? No.
Instynkt mieli jak zwierzęta? Nie.
They fought to save the people and the nation. They were willing to sacrifice their lives.
Oni walczyli po to, żeby była z tego korzyść dla ludzi, dla narodu. Chcieli się poświęcić.
Without that, since the Mongol invasion, there would have been no Poland.
Gdyby nie to, to od czasów mongolskiej inwazji Polska by nie istniała.
And when you think of the people who did that, and you know many of them, and some of you were those people in the former time, the last Hitler period, and dealing with the recent regime here.
Macie bardzo wiele przykładów takich ludzi, jak się przypatrzycie w tył, ludzi, którzy walczyli za Hitlera, za okupacji, za ostatniej także reżimu.
It meant something. The life of the person who took the risk of doing that meant something to take that risk.
To przecież miało jakieś znaczenie. To, że ludzie byli gotowi poświęcić swoje życie w przeszłości, było rodzajem przekazu, jakiegoś komunikatu, który chcieli nam przekazać na temat znaczenia ich życia.
How many people today would stand up to the same challenge?
Ilu ludzi dzisiaj podjęłoby to samo wyzwanie?
So therefore, a great crisis is an advantage, and it forces us and forces the little people to pay attention to what some of their leaders have been telling them.
Wielki kryzys jest w takim oglądzie, staje się pewną okazją, która budzi ludzi, która mówi właśnie tym ludziom, którzy sami na małość się skazali, że oto przychodzi czas, żeby coś zmienić i żeby posłuchać ich przywódców, że oni coś mają do powiedzenia, jeżeli tacy się pojawiają.
Great tribulations sometimes come as a blessing.
Chcę powiedzieć, że wielkie takie zaburzenia czasami pojawiają się jako rodzaj błogosławieństwa.
If there are prophets to awaken the people to what their true interest is. There's some people here in this room would be very happy for Poland to make its own policy.
Zresztą to, że za siebie myśleć i własną politykę robić, to jest rzecz, za którą wielu tęskni. Tu w Polsce i myślę, że na tej sali jest wielu ludzi, którzy bardzo chętnie powitaliby sytuację, w której Polska mogłaby sama decydować o własnej polityce.
But it must ask the permission of the European...
Ale musicie prosić o pozwolenie Brukseli.
From the IMF, from the European Union.
Z Europy, z Zachodniej, z Międzynarodowego Funduszu Walutowego.
You want schools for your children, you have to get permission from the European Union.
Chcecie mieć cokolwiek zrobić, to musicie pytać o pozwolenie z Europy w tej chwili.
You want to have a currency, you have to get permission from the IMF.
Nie macie pieniędzy, chcecie mieć jakieś rozwiązania monetarne, musicie prosić o to pozwolenie z Międzynarodowego Funduszu Walutowego.
So our problem is, I've discussed in general terms, there is a solution for this mess. Put the thing through bankruptcy under what we call Chapter 11 principle of the United States.
A zatem, tak jak mówię, istnieje rozwiązanie jednak dla tej sytuacji. Otóż spróbujmy popatrzeć na zbliżający się kryzys jako na możliwość zadziałania w sytuacji bankrutującego systemu i zastosować do niej tak zwany rozdział 11 Konstytucji, ustawy o bankructwie w Stanach.
Adopt a new policy of reconstruction centered on the idea of developing cooperation in Eurasia.
Pomyśleć o nowej polityce odbudowy, spróbować ją wmontować w koncepcję nowego rozwoju w skali całego megakontynentu eurazjatyckiego.
Develop the great cultural dialogue between Europe and East and South Asia.
Rozwinąć wielki dialog kulturalny pomiędzy Europą i Azją Wschodnią.
And do this with the idea that this is the way to organize a benefit for the entire world.
A przede wszystkim wyjść z taką ideą, jako że ona jest z korzyścią dla całego świata.
That is consistent with what we call the common good.
To się zgadza z ideą dobra wspólnego.
That's consistent with what John Paul II has called the common good.
To się zgadza z tym, o czym mówi papież Jan Paweł II, zasadą dobra wspólnego.
Therefore we should do it.
A zatem zróbmy to.
Where do we get the permission to do it?
Ale czy pozwolą to zrobić?
And in the meantime, what do we do?
Co w międzyczasie mamy zrobić?
Well, I'm an old fighter.
Ja jestem cały czas, walczę cały czas.
I'm impatiently patient.
Ale jestem niecierpliwie cierpliwy.
I'll continue the fight.
Dalej będę walczył.
I will not complain if we don't win tomorrow morning.
Nie będę się skarżył, jeżeli jutro nie zwyciężymy.
I'm determined we're going to win the war, though.
I'm determined to
Win the war.
Aha, natomiast mam wolę wygrania wojny.
I can't tell you what day.
Nie mogę powiedzieć kiedy.
I can't promise.
Nie mogę obiecać.
I can tell you how we're going to win the war, though,
Mogę natomiast powiedzieć, w jaki sposób zamierzam wygrać tę wojnę
and tell you to stay at it until we win.
i powiedzieć Państwu, żebyście trzymali się, dopóki nie zwyciężymy.
That, of course, is an old Polish custom.
To jest zresztą zgodne ze starym polskim zwyczajem.
That's why Poland exists. So, therefore, what we need is the clear ideas.
To, czego najpierw na początek potrzebujemy, to jasne idee.
We need the ideas that we would want to have from the prophets.
Idee, których nie otrzymamy od proroków.
We must work for those ideas in whatever way we can, day by day.
Musimy dla tych idei, te idee wypracowywać z dnia na dzień, cały czas, codziennie.
We must be prudent but bold at the same time.
Musimy być ostrożni, roztropni, ale jednocześnie otwarci cały czas.
We must be bold above all in the area of ideas.
Przede wszystkim musimy być uczciwi w zakresie idei.
And we must see ourselves as merely a part of humanity which has been on this planet for a long time.
Musimy patrzeć na siebie jako na taką część ludzkości, która na tej planecie jest już od bardzo dawna.
And we must look at ourselves as this part of humanity as God looks at this part of humanity.
I musimy patrzeć na siebie jako na tę część ludzkości, tak jak i Bóg na nas patrzy.
We must say, what does God say our mission is for existing in our time?
Musimy zdać sobie sprawę z tego, jaka jest misja powierzona nam przez Boga na egzystencję w tym czasie.
And we must accept that responsibility with joy.
I musimy z radością zaakceptować taką odpowiedzialność, jaka z tego wynika.
I think we can win soon.
Sądzę, że wkrótce zwyciężymy.
The main thing is to have fraternity among us, among nations.
Najważniejsze jest, żebyśmy mieli braterstwo i taką szczerość między sobą, między narodami.
And share with John Paul II.
I dzielili ją z Janem Pawłem II.
The idea which he's expressing in action now.
Ideę, która wyrażana jest w tej chwili w działaniu.
God looks at us in our time.
Bóg na nas patrzy w naszych czasach.
What is our mission in our time?
Jaka jest nasza misja?
Let that be our joy. Thank you.
Sprawdźmy, żeby była radością naszą.
Regarding your prescription for the future, first of all, I fervently wish that we see you in the White House in 2004. That in that high position you will help implement the idea which you mentioned about nation states in your concluding part of the address.
Thank you very much. Now, 20 years later, the world has changed. It was done specifically with the idea Mrs. Gandhi was then Prime Minister, and our intent was to provide through her, we've had discussions before in earlier times, and it seemed that the most useful thing we could do for India, since she was disposed to know about such things, was to provide something that she and her associates could use in India to devise a plan for India, because we thought that the long-term view was needed. And we saw that about 2 generations be required to realize anything that India would accept as a long-term view. And she, of course, was sympathetic, because she would always look at the poor of India as her reference point. If it doesn't benefit the poor, there's something wrong. And that's my view. If it doesn't benefit the poor of India to elevate their station, we fail. If you benefited the poor and uplifted them, well, then you're moving the whole country in the right direction. And it would take, because we would see things as Mrs. Sampson pointed out to us at one of the villages we visited. You could see the problem of the teachers in trying to draw get the parents to accept that bringing the children to the schools, which the schools teachers were devoted to trying to help these students, these young fellows. So that in order to make the revolution in India that was required, you would have to actually motivate a process in which education would really take off and people would understand the importance of supporting it. So we said 40 years, and then some of the things that are required, there were 2 or 3 generations required. So it's still relevant. I would simply situate it the same way of thinking, with some of the same objectives today. My view of relations is largely a spiritual one, in my sense of the term spiritual. And that is the cognitive powers of mind must be engaged. You must engage in transmitting concepts back and forth, not just words, not information. And my concern has been to establish re-establish relations with people who think, who are the thinkers, typical thinkers of India, knowing that the radiation of thinking among thinking people is the way in which science works and which politics really works. And therefore I was more concerned to have the opportunity to report on certain things which I thought Indians ought to hear from me, because I'm prepared to tell the truth, whereas some other people from my country are not. And the Indians should have the advantage of hearing some of the truths of the matter, so they could judge for themselves how to look at some of these problems. So maybe that is spiritual. What do we think? To engage, to set forth channels for the future where we're more efficiently engaged in communicating ideas which might lead to useful results. My view is Russia is a Eurasian nation. It is not simply in Europe and Asia, but it is Eurasian in character. It has Eurasian instincts as a nation, as a national body. It has ties to Russia, to China, to India, to other countries, which are crucial, which are unique. That doesn't mean that India and China always agree with Russia, but it means it's a bridge country between Western Europe and the countries of East and South Asia. And therefore, my concern is to get Russians to adopt that view, and thus to help to bring together, for example, let's say the question of bilateral relations between China and India, which are much discussed here, and I suppose are much discussed in China as well. How do you deal with the fact that, especially since 1962, there has been a continuing sense of a potential military conflict between Russia and China, China and India, which affects all of us? How do you bring these nations together? How do you define a common interest over and above this continuing issue of conflict?
I must introduce myself as Professor Kaushik said. Jagdeep Yadav, former Union Minister, ex-member of Parliament, as my secretary is sitting by my side. I think that you are visiting India after 20 years. 17. 17 years. Even that is a very high. I wish you could visit more often to this part of the world, not only India, Russia, Southeast Asia, China. Because as you rightly said that this part of the world will play a very important role in shaping the new just economic order.
What I shall do today is present the evolution of the policy which is presented to us by the coming visit of the President of China. The history of it, as I was personally involved in developing that policy over a long period of time, partly as a personal effort and later as an effort which began to make some impact on the shaping of the policies of the world during the course of the 1980s. The intent of London The intent of the British Commonwealth is to do to China what they did to the Soviet Union. That's their policy. Above all, they do not wish to allow the United States to enter into a partnership with China, which is an alliance, in effect, among two nations seeking to find global stability and global economic growth. And thus, China is besieged and threatened on every border. That's changing. What's happened in Taiwan recently with George Soros and company collapsing the Taiwanese economy as he participated in collapsing the Southeast Asia economies has had a political effect in Taiwan. But from every part of Asia, we can trace British intelligence operations, supported in part by some scoundrels from the United States, such as George Bush and his brother Prescott, which are attacking China, trying to destroy it. You have a pro-British faction in Japan, which wants to make trouble. You have in the Congress, members of the Congress who never had a passport before the end of the Congress. And they're now trying to make foreign policy. Most of them don't even know where countries outside the United States are. But they have strong opinions on the subject. Their ignorance strengthens their opinion. There's instability in Central Asia. It's a cockpit of trouble. There are threats to China from all around it, launched largely by British intelligence and by the British Commonwealth operations. So China's a besieged nation. Okay, now I'll have played briefly a section from a televised press conference which I conducted in Berlin on Columbus Day, October 12th, 1988, at the Bristol-Kempinski Hotel. This is the same televised press conference which was later rebroadcast in the United States during October the same month as part of a nationwide campaign, election campaign, my campaign. This is the actual genesis. This broadcast and what led into it is the actual genesis of the program I've just described or identified, and is the genesis of the policy thinking which must go into the design of the agreements reached between the President of the United States and the President of China. Proceed.
Under the proper conditions, many today will agree that the time has come for early steps toward the reunification of Germany, with the obvious prospect that Berlin might resume its role as the nation's capital. For the United States, as for Germans and Europe generally, the question is, will this reunification process be brought about by assimilating the Federal Republic into the East Bloc's economy or economic range of influence, or can it be accomplished in a different way? In other words, is a united Germany to come into being as a part of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, as President de Gaulle proposed, or as Mr. Gorbachev has desired, a Europe from the Urals to the Atlantic? I see the possibility that the process of unification could occur precisely as de Gaulle proposed.
What I'd forecast at that point was that in the remainder of that address is that during the coming months that we would see the disintegration of the former Soviet bloc for economic reasons. This disintegration would begin politically in Poland, would spread through Eastern Europe, and that the United States and Western Europe must prepare for this process of disintegration of the Soviet-dominated economic zone, and that the United States must support the early reunification of Germany under these conditions, and that proposal should be made in the context of offers by the United States and others to assist the states of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in economic recovery by helping them correct some of the faults in their system. It happened, as you know, the following year. At that point, I turned to my wife, and Helga, and we discussed the implementation, which had to be, this is at the point the wall was beginning to crumble, the measures which must be taken by the United States and Europe, Western Europe, in order to deal with the disintegration which is ongoing in the former Soviet bloc. The proposal that came from that first was called the European Triangle Proposal. Here we have that. That there is an area in Western Europe, an approximate spherical triangle whose key points, whose vertices, are Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. This is the historic, represents the historic concentration of infrastructural and related economic and technological development in Europe, which has been the greatest in the world. Here was embedded, at that time in 1988, 1989, was embedded the greatest potential for machine tool technologies, radiation from Europe into Eurasia. And my proposal was the United States had to enter into an agreement with these nations of Europe in order to establish partnership with this triangle zone in order to extend development corridors based on transportation corridors, including the technology of magnetic levitation rail, or rail substitute, into St. Petersburg, into Moscow, etc., down through Italy and so forth, and beyond, as a great development project. And therefore, the crucial thing to all of these parts of the world, whether it's Africa, South Asia, East Asia, is to provide to these sectors of the world the right to development. The right to development involves education, infrastructure development, and above all, the machine tool design capability without which you cannot have continuous sustainable development. Thus, that was the principle of the sector. That by developing land routes of efficient, high-speed transportation throughout Eurasia, and using these routes not only to support trade and industry, but to support the transmission at a high rate of the machine tool design sector into these countries, then and only then would it be possible to lift the greatest part of the world population, which is concentrated in South and East Asia, and also in Africa. Secondly, to lift these parts of the world out of the legacy of 19th century imperialism and the legacy of second-class citizenship in world affairs.
Я свой роль, мы представляем нашу уважаемую гостью Линду LaRouche. There are two things which are concern to me in being in Russia this week.
Дело в том, что я на этой неделе нахожусь в России, меня волнуют две проблемы.
Not only in Russia, but in the world as a whole, we have the greatest crisis of the 20th century.
Не только в России, а во всем мире в целом мы видим развитие самого крупного кризиса 20 века.
I think you are acquainted with the situation of the former Soviet Union.
Я думаю, что вы хорошо знакомы с ситуацией в бывшем Советском Союзе.
It's a disaster. It cannot continue. It would become irreversible. Those of you, like my friend Bobisk, who are veterans of World War II,
Если вы такие же, как мой друг Побис, который является ветераном войны,
lived through a certain experience.
И это означает, что это означает определенный жизненный опыт.
Experience of the 20s, 1920s.
Это опыт, который пережили мы в 20-е годы,
as boys,
когда мы были еще мальчишками.
Lived through the 1930s as adolescents.
Потом мы были подростками в 30-е годы.
Lived through the war.
Мы пережили войну.
Served in uniform.
Мы служили в армии.
And the post-war period.
Мы пережили послевоенный период.
Now, the world as it's known to people who were born after the war,
Мир в том виде, который он известен людям, родившимся после Второй мировой войны,
is absolutely different than those of us who lived through the Depression and war.
совершенно отличается от того мира, которым он был во время депрессии и во время Второй мировой войны.
In our time, during the Depression and war, we were giants compared to what came after.
Во время депрессии и во время Второй мировой войны мы были гигантами по сравнению с тем, чем мы стали позже.
And take two examples. Take Russia and the United States.
Возьмем лишь два примера. Возьмем Россию и США.
In the 1939, the United States had been through a depression for 10 years.
К 1939 году США уже десятый лет переживали депрессию.
We had mass unemployment.
У нас была массовая безработица.
We had misery.
У нас были очень несчастные люди.
We had people who had gone more or less insane because they had lost their dignity.
У нас некоторые люди сошли в какой-то степени с ума, потому что они потеряли свое собственное достоинство.
People with advanced degrees and sciences couldn't get jobs, hardly as dishwashers.
Люди, у которых имелись университетские степени в естественных науках, не могли получить соответственную работу, им приходилось мыть посуду.
In 1939-1940, Roosevelt launched the United States on a great industrial development program.
А в 1939-1940 году Рузвельт принял кампанию и начал осуществлять кампанию индустриального развития, национального индустриального развития.
It was for purposes of war.
Для цели войны.
We took 17 million people out of the labor force and put them in uniforms, military service.
17 миллионов людей из производственного сектора перешли в армию и надели военную форму.
Women replaced them in the factories.
А на заводах их заменили женщины.
In 4 years, from a bankrupt United States, we created the greatest industrial machine on this planet.
И за 4 года из страны банкрота США создала очень мощную мощную экономическую машину.
After the initial defeat in 1941,
после первых поражений 1941 года
a similar, more agonizing experience occurred in the Soviet Union.
Аналогичный агонистический опыт был пережит и в Советском Союзе.
People with their bare hands made an industrial war machine.
Люди просто одними руками создавали индустриальную военную машину.
For every Wehrmacht soldier who died on the Russian front, 10 Russians died.
И одного немецкого солдата вермахта, который умирал, умирали 10 человек российских, советских военных.
It was a great, heroic mobilization.
Это была великая героическая мобилизация.
It was not pretty.
Это все не очень здорово выглядело.
It was monstrous.
Это выглядело совершенно жутко.
It was war at its most intense.
Это была ужасная интенсивная война.
Yet the beautiful thing was that people were capable of doing it.
Но самое хорошее, что стало ясно, это то, что люди могли это все осуществить.
And then in the immediate period after the war.
А теперь и также за периодом, который последовал непосредственно после окончания войны.
Peace came, but there was no peace.
Мир пришел с одной стороны, с другой стороны мира не было.
The ruined country was rebuilt with bare, bleeding hands by hungry people.
И разрушенная страна была восстановлена чисто руками людей, которые еще не всегда были сыты.
So people who lived through that experience, as in the United States or Russia,
и люди, которые пережили это как в США, так и в России,
know what people and nations can do in the face of a crisis like that we face today. What was this based on? The progress before former progress.
На чем же основывался прогресс до сегодняшнего дня?
Two things.
На двух вещах.
The universalization of education, or movement in that direction.
введение всеобщего образования или, во всяком случае, работа в этом направлении.
The first standard of ability of freedom is the ability to read and write.
Первый уровень, первая обязательная, так сказать, предпосылка свободы – это умение читать и писать.
That is to communicate ideas.
То есть, иными словами, возможность передавать свою мысль, излагать свою мысль.
The second standard is a process of education in which the student relives in the mind the greatest discoveries of principle of history before.
The second principle – это такой модель образования, когда ученик создает в своем сознании первое открытие, сделанное величайшими учеными.
Because a child who relives the great discoveries, reenacts in the child's own mind the great discoveries in geometry and other things of the past thousands of years, is reliving the experience not only of the storehouse of human knowledge, but is learning how to discover.
Дело в том, что ребенок, который переживает или проходит через этапы открытия, которое было сделано, может быть, несколько лет назад, он проживает практически пятитысячную историю цивилизации, которая насчитывает 5000 лет. И он не только приобщается к этим открытиям, он понимает, как нужно делать это, каким образом делается открытие.
A student who memorizes a mathematics physics textbook is probably not good for physics.
Человек, студент, который лишь запоминает содержимое учебника по физике и математике, может быть, и не очень хороший студент, может быть, он не годится для физики.
The student who works through in his own mind the crucial discoveries of principle in physics is a physicist.
А тот студент, который в своем уме проживает и проходит, повторяет тот опыт, который прошел открыватель того или иного закона, как раз он и является хорошим физиком.
He has not just learned ideas, he has learned how to discover.
То есть он выучил не только идеи, он понял, как делаются открытия.
And this was called a classical humanist education.
И это называлось классическим гуманитарным образованием.
So, when you have a great number of children
И когда мы имеем большое количество детей,
with that kind of education,
вот с образованием такого рода,
in a society which offers them the opportunity to use that education,
и они живут в обществе, которое предоставляет им возможность использовать, применять это образование,
both to participate in production
то есть как участвовать в производстве
and to participate in running the society,
и участвовать в управлении обществом,
participate in making the policy of the society by discussing the policy.
Позволяет участвовать в разработке политики этой страны и в принятии решений по политике.
Then no longer is a peasant an ox.
Тогда уже крестьянин не остается быком.
He becomes a creative personality
Он становится творческой личностью,
who can increase the productive powers of not only himself but his neighbors.
который может увеличить производственные силы, потенциал не только самого себя, но и своих соседей.
And thus, these ideas of education around discovery and art, discovery and science, the idea of using these discoveries to improve the power of man over nature, to investment in scientific and technological progress. This is the difference between man and the beast.
И вот эти просветительские идеи, которые заключаются в том, что человек учится делать открытия, человек получает образование как гуманитарное, так и в науке, именно это дает человеку власть над природой. И именно это отличает человека от животного.
For example, remember when Kennedy announced the U.S. space program, man landing on the moon.
Помните, когда Кеннеди объявил американскую космическую программу о высадке человека на Луне?
Remember in Russia, Sputnik in 1957.
Помните российский спутник, 1957 год?
Remember the optimism of hearing that silly beep.
Вы помните оптимизм, который был связан связано вот с этим сигналом, который подавал спутник.
Remember the optimism among the U.S. population when Kennedy announced the man landing on the moon.
И помните, какой был оптимизм американского населения, когда Кеннеди объявил программу высадки на Луне?
Remember the excitement in 1969 when man first stepped foot on the moon.
И помните, какое было волнение в 69 году, когда нога человека первый раз ступила на Луну?
Look at that statue of Yuri Gagarin.
И посмотрите на статую Юрия Гагарина.
Remember when it was put up and why?
Помните, когда ее поставили и почему?
Because it was a source of inspiration to the Soviet population.
Потому что это был источник вдохновения для советского населения.
It made it good to live in such times. If we can be conscious of this and what these things mean, I
Если бы
think
мы
we can win.
осознали это и понимали, что все это значит, я думаю, что мы могли бы выиграть.
That's the main purpose of my work here.
И это основная цель моей работы в вашей стране.
Может быть, попросим ответить на вопросы, господин Ларуш, если такие есть. Да, пожалуйста. Если бы были такие кандидаты в президенты в России.
If only there were candidates for president.
До чего мы не видим подобного? Вот таким. Я думаю, что ваш великий друг, товарищ Побис Кузнецов, я назову его фамилию, потому что вы ее не назвали.
And I think that your friend, Pobis Kuznetsov, and I mentioned his name, which you didn't say.
Я думаю, что он подтвердит, что был такой на земле, на советской земле, великий человек.
I think he will back me up in saying that there was in the Soviet Union a great man.
Его зовут Александр Александрович Фетисов.
Named Fekisa.
Он рожден был в 12 году.
He was born in 1920.
Он воевал в Японии.
And he fought on the front against Japan.
Он был моряк.
He was Navy man.
Он был начальником службы тыла Тихоокеанского флота.
He was the head of the rear services for the Pacific.
А потом он занялся системным анализом.
After which he went into systems analysis.
У меня вопрос. Все, кто занимается системным анализом, это плохие люди?
My question is, are all people who do systems analysis bad people?
No, they're just white people who drink too much whiskey. But the distinction is this.
Значит, ключевое различие заключается в следующем.
The point is that you have today most mathematicians, when they get their doctoral degree in mathematics, pure mathematics, go insane. They haven't done it before.
Дело в том, что в основном сегодня математики, которые пишут и получают докторскую степень, они чистые математики. Они в основном сходят с ума, если с ними этого не произошло раньше. Почему?
The question of development takes you outside of mathematics.
Вопрос развития выводит вас за пределы математики.
You take the last words of Riemann's famous habilitation dissertation.
Давайте возьмем последние слова докторской диссертации Римана. Квалификационной диссертации Римана.
To deal with the questions of development, you must leave the Department of Mathematics and go into the Department of Physics, experimental physics.
Для того, чтобы правильно рассмотреть вопрос развития, вам надо выйти за пределы математики и перейти уже в область физики.
And when you have proven a physical principle,
А когда вы доказали физический принцип,
you come back to mathematics and you change it.
вы возвращаетесь к математику и изменяете ее.
You make a new mathematics.
И вы создаете новую математику.
But you cannot derive physics from mathematics. You must derive mathematics from physics.
Бывает физика без математики. Бывает и физика без математики.
Is there any physics without mathematics?
Yes.
Для того, чтобы получить на нее ответ.
Doesn't it seem to you that you've taken the path of narrowing the question area so that an answer can be achieved?
No. The point is that in all, as you know, in all scientific work, the ultimate thing is to reduce the issue before you to a simple test of measurement.
Дело в том, что в каждой научной работе очень важно сократить.
Существенным является поиск способа измерения.
The question of measurement is man.
А вопрос измерения является человеком.
For example, how do we know something is truth?
Ну, например, как мы знаем, что является что-то правдой или нет?
Formally, I can describe, and many have done that, describe exactly as Riemann does, how you can develop a system of scientific progress in a formal sense.
Например, с формальной точки зрения можно сделать так же, как и Риман, как можно описать прогресс с формальной точки зрения. Да?
But what's the standard of that?
Каков стандарт, каков
How do you measure scientific progress?
как вы измеряете, какая единица измерения действительно научного прогресса?
You are measuring not nature, you're measuring man's ability to conquer nature.
А вы измеряете не природу, вы измеряете способность человека обуздать природу.
Therefore, the test of whether the human cognitive apparatus is a reliable instrument for conquering nature.
То есть, или вопрос заключается в том, являются ли познавательные способности человека адекватной оружием для покорения природы.
What is the test? The test then comes out.
В чем же заключается испытание? В чем же заключается?
It comes out as a physical economic test.
Это физико-экономический тест.
And we increase mankind's power over the universe by this discovery.
То есть увеличили мы власть человека над природой, получив вот это открытие.
And we increased man's power to exist.
Увеличили мы способность или силу человека к выживанию.
And we increased life expectancy.
Увеличили продолжительность жизни.
And we improved demography.
Улучшили мы демографическую.
And we improved function of the individual.
Улучшили мы функции индивида.
A higher quality individual who lives longer, who is more productive.
То есть это человек, индивидуум более высокого качества, который более продуктивно работает и будет дольше жить.
Is it a method which preserves the achievements of past generations for the benefit of the future?
И сохраняет ли этот метод достижения предыдущих поколений для того, чтобы их использовали последующие?
So man is the measure.
То есть человек является.
I think we have to establish one point, which is fundamental.
Все монетаристы говорят альтернативы монетарной теории нет.
All the monetarists repeat constantly, there is no alternative to monetary theory.
Вот нужно именно, когда нет альтернативы, говорить, есть
And we need to be able to say quite clearly when they say there is no alternative, to reply there is an alternative, it's physical economy. That's very natural.
Естественно-научный подход.
This is a natural scientific approach to a social economic system.
The vast territory of Siberia and Russia in general, which has an extremely low population density, and with modern technology can become habitable, even the Arctic region, of course, with enough energy.
Дело в том, что мы можем взять территорию Сибири или в России в целом, у которой очень низкая плотность населения, и современными, при наличии современных технологий все эти огромные пространства можно сделать обитаемыми.
It cannot become economically habitable without large-scale transportation networks.
Но с точки зрения экономической, эти регионы не могут стать обитаемыми без наличия хорошей системы транспорта.
And a transportation system must not only have a geographic destination, it must have an economic destination.
И транспортная система должна иметь не только географическую точку прибытия, но также экономическую точку прибытия.
So the way to develop Siberia is by having transportation links to South Asia and to China, which are the great concentrations of world population.
Дело в том, что можно развивать Сибирь, прокладывая через нее дороги в Южную Азию и в Китай, в котором огромное население.
This is strategically necessary for peace on the continent of Eurasia under present and coming conditions. What's the solution? As I said at the outset, the problem today is denial.
People are afraid. They're afraid of power. They're afraid of the power of the IMF. They're afraid of the power of the United States. And therefore, they say we have to play by the generally accepted rules among the nations of the IMF and by the United States. Therefore, when you try to solve a problem, you say, we have to find a solution within the rules. You can't violate the rules. You've got to find an alternative within the rules. But what I've indicated to you, there are no solutions within the rules. This has been a long-term process of decadence, of culture and economy. We no longer have the kind of leaders in politics we had 20 years ago or earlier. Our people coming out of our universities do not have the competence of people coming out of the universities a generation ago. We are in a decadent culture, a decadent system, which is destroying us. And you're not going to find solutions in a system which has shown that its axioms, the definitions, axioms and postulates of the system ensure destruction. But people say, but you've got to go by the rules. What are the rules? The rules are precisely the rules, the axioms, the definitions, the postulates which have destroyed us. Why can't we change the rules? Aren't we human beings? Don't we represent nations which have get this out of the first chapter of Genesis. Is man and woman not made equally in the image of the creator of the universe and endowed with these powers? Do not we have the authority above anything on this planet to change the rules? We have the power. That's what sovereignty means. Sovereignty means the power to make the rules by which we can survive. That doesn't mean we can make any rules we want to. It means we have to have responsibility and competence. But we have the right to deliberate. We in the United States are in a mess, a terrible mess.
Nós nos Estados Unidos estamos em uma bagunça tremenda.
We have great power still, but it's a sham. A sham.
Somos hoje uma grande potência, mas, na verdade, tudo isso é uma fraude.
Without a revival of the economies of the South and Central America, the United States cannot work its way out of its own onrushing depression.
Como a maioria dos países da América Central, os Estados Unidos não podem sair sozinhos dessa confusão em que se meteram.
Either we shall sail together or we shall sink together.
Ou nós nos salvamos juntos, ou nós vamos para o buraco juntos.
And what I can hope to contribute most of all, apart from what I do inside the United States and elsewhere,
E o que eu espero é poder contribuir de tudo que eu sei do que está se passando nos Estados Unidos em toda a parte,
is to try to provoke among us as nations a dialogue on these great issues.
É tentar provocar entre nós um diálogo entre nações, um diálogo entre tradições.
We must not have a hegemonic system.
Não temos que ter um sistema hegemônico.
A slave is a poor worker.
Um escravo é um trabalhador fraco, um trabalhador ruim.
If you cannot evoke the willpower and creative mentality of a nation's people, you cannot get much good out of them.
Se você não pode provocar o poder criativo, o poder da vontade nas pessoas, não se pode esperar nada delas.
Some may be more powerful, some smaller and weaker.
Algumas poderão ser mais poderosas, mais fortes, outras poderão ser mais fracas, mais débeis.
But all must be treated as personalities with equal rights.
Mas todas devem ser tratadas como personalidades com direitos iguais.
From each we must demand the same thing. They muster their creative power to help solve problems.
E da mesma forma elas devem desenvolver capacidade de resolver os seus próprios problemas.
We need above all a community of ideas, a community of principle.
Precisamos acima de tudo uma comunidade de ideias, uma comunidade de princípios.
We want to eliminate all kinds of supranational control over any nation among us.
temos que eliminar todo e qualquer tipo de controle supranacional sobre as nações de todo o mundo.
And finally, look at Brazil.
Finalmente, olhem para o Brasil.
This wonderfully large, virtually untouched wilderness.
Esta magnificamente grande e virtualmente intocada imensidão.
With some concentrations of development, but vast undeveloped areas.
Com algumas áreas desenvolvidas, mas vastas áreas subdesenvolvidas.
Symbolized by the sheer might of the Amazon River.
Simbolizadas pela grandeza da bacia amazônica.
If you look at the Amazon region from the standpoint of the great Russian scientist Vernadsky, who defines the terms biosphere and noosphere.
Se vocês olharem para a grande região amazônica, sob o ponto de vista do que o grande cientista russo Vladimir Vernadsky definia como a biosfera e a noosfera,
you have a sense of the great power for the future implicit in the development of that in a scientifically sound and rational way.
Vocês poderão ter uma ideia, um sentido do enorme potencial de desenvolvimento daquela região ainda em grande parte inexplorada.
That is one of the great projects of development for the planet as a whole.
Esse é um dos grandes projetos de desenvolvimento para o planeta como um todo.
And it should be a source of inspiration to all Brazil about what this nation can do.
Isso deveria se tornar uma fonte de inspiração para todos os brasileiros sobre o que esse país pode se tornar.
And the United States should be very happy to have such a partner.
Os Estados Unidos deveriam se tornar muito felizes em ajudar tal empreendimento. Muito obrigado.
I wish to extend my gratitude to the Institute, to the Center, and to His Highness for the invitation to be here with you today. My subject is the Middle East as a strategic crossroads. The world has come to a crossroads in modern history, if the world were to continue along the pathway currently chosen by my government and some others. Civilization will be plunged for as long as a generation or more into a global dark age comparable to that which struck Europe 7.5 centuries ago. We must not pretend that that danger does not exist. We must commit ourselves to the hopeful alternative which wise governments would prefer. Therefore, I should speak frankly but optimistically of a second crossroad, the Middle East. Whatever U.S. policy might appear to be now, the reality of the present world economic crisis will probably force some sweeping changes in U.S. policy and thinking during the near future. There is no hope for the economic revival of the United States from the present world crisis without precisely such cooperation in the land transport-based development of the Eurasian and African continents as a whole. If the U.S. is to find a solution to the inevitable early disasters caused by its present policies, this must include a special role for the Middle East. The approach to a solution to that strategic crisis does not lie in oil as such, but in the way petroleum production and marketing can be applied to serve the broader long-term interests of the region. Stable governments within the region and stable relations within areas outside the region are the first line of defense of the region from the forces and other perils which presently menace. The crucial role of transport development is a leading example of the measures of defense required. The special advantage of modern rail or magnetic levitation, as compared with sea-based transport, lies in the elementary fact that with rare special exceptions, the product transported by sea does not improve in itself during transport. Under the right conditions, long-range transportation corridors, which are based on the central role of monorail or magnetic levitation transport, are in net effect cheaper and faster routes of transport than the seas. As in the cases of the original U.S. transcontinental rail systems, these routes were not merely roads of transport. The transportation system transformed a virtual economic wasteland to a rich region of powerful economic development. In effect, every average kilometer or investment in the transportation system along these main and subsidiary routes gave back to the nation a net amount of produced wealth from agriculture, mining, and manufacturing far in excess of the cost of developing and maintaining the transportation system. Instead of thinking of connecting 2 points with a long-distance rail line or magnetic levitation system, think of the transport line as the central spine of a development corridor for up to 50 to 100 kilometers width. Running parallel to the spine are main line conduits of water and power. At appropriate places along the spine, agro-industrial residential complexes are built. Satellite areas of a similar type lie within the same corridor. What I have just described in a summary way is a modern equivalent of the methods which produced an agricultural industrial revolution in the United States approximately a century and a half ago. By concentrating resources of transportation, water, and power within development corridors, the most efficient use of these resources can be managed. The most economical use of the total available land area is achieved by tending to concentrate development in those corridors. Under conditions of continued growth, subsidiary development corridors will branch out from the principal ones. The same method can be applied with a combination of technologies either existing or within reach to transform the interior of Asia, including the deserts and tundras. Under proper policies, the physical net cost of such development corridors is less than zero. As goods flow along the spine of the corridor, new wealth is generated in and around each of the nodal agro-industrial residential locations along the route.
There was a confrontation in the past between producer and consumer. Do you see any hope in the future that both sides can set and plan future of cooperation?
I see it as the hope. The hope is precisely this. We are in, as I said, we are in a collapse of the world financial monetary system, a collapse of the economy. We published in my magazine and others, we published the figures on this. It's clear. All the attempts to deny this are becoming undeniable. All right, under such conditions, how would the world recover? Now you're looking at, from your background, which obviously includes this knowledge, you're looking at a system which is no longer a sane financial system. We are now operating on the basis of financial derivatives which run into hundreds of trillions of dollars. We don't know how many there are because they're unregulated market. These are obligations. We have bubbles, all kinds of financial bubbles. We see the collapse of the so-called telecom sector, which is collapsing. So we're into a major bankruptcy now. This means that we are at a point where we can save the economies through cooperations among national governments, but it requires state-to-state agreements of the type we made in terms of the first IMF agreement. If we went back to the model of 1945, 1965, and say, should we do this? Put the world through bankruptcy reorganization. Do the things you do in bankruptcy, as one of the so-called Chapter 11 in the United States. Get government credit mobilized to large infrastructure projects and so on. What do you do? Well, to maintain that system, we have to have a system of gold reserve-based system. Because we have to have a fixed currency value or a peg ratio, otherwise you cannot have cheap loans, 1 and 2% in the international markets on long term. Under those conditions, the next thing you go to is certain categories of trade. Now this means that, as I've indicated, the price of petroleum should be a negotiated price between consumer and producer nations, among them, which should be fixed because we will now be fixing energy, which is the biggest key commodity in international markets. We fix that to the rate of currency. Now we can have an economy that will work. and we can invest. So therefore, we have to go to a fixed currency system, which includes precisely that kind of thing that we used to think we had before 1971. We have to go back to that. And I presume that under conditions of a crisis, when governments admit there's a crisis, then they will be willing to come together as governments and say, let's make a new system based on the best experience from the previous system. And under that condition, that would happen. What is our interest as a total person if we know we will all die? It is what we do with our life. It's what's said in the New Testament about the parable of the talents. You are given a talent. It's a life. What are you going to do with it? What you do with that life is what you are for the rest of eternity. People who are effective leaders of nations have that kind of love for their people and for the people of the world of that kind. Because they have a mission. It's given to them. This ability to have this thing, this commitment to immortality, is something that's given to you. Life is loaned to you from birth to death. And what you do with that life becomes what you are. That's your interest. Are you giving justice? Are you acting for the future of mankind? Do you have the eyes of the past dead upon you? Do you have honor in the eyes of those who died and went before you? So you never elect a leader as a leader and trust him as leader unless they have that kind of moral commitment. We would hope, and I would hope that sometime in the future, we would not need to find that such leaders were exceptions in their people. In the meantime, we count on such leaders to guide, or people who can approximate that, to lead us and lead the people through the swamps of danger.